Last week we had Dean Mozaffarian, and today we have President Khuri, who does not want an introduction and does not need an introduction. He's a par excellence researcher, fantastic physician, seeing patients nowadays, establishing programs, building programs, fundraising, name it, you have it, and we want to do this all in sharp. So without further ado, Fadlo, I would like to welcome you, and we're very excited to have you.
Thank you very much, Ghada. It's a pleasure to be here. Iman, unless you're going to leave, move down. Come on, guys, you know my habits. Same for you, Qasim. So what I thought today, instead of boring you guys with more overviews of the research that we used to do, because I'm still trying to figure out eventually when we do re-engage in research what we're going to do, to talk about the disease that I've spent most of my life working on, de-emphasizing the work that we did. I will talk briefly about the work, but from my perspective, it's very interesting to look at the evolution of a disease, at least over the last decade, where we are, what are the possibilities, and what drive research-related decisions from the personal and the national level. And I hope that in 45 minutes, and I'll take my watch off so I don't talk too long, it'll keep me honest, I can get us there. So I thought that this really was the best song that characterizes lung cancer research. It's actually also one of my favorite songs, so I use it to characterize everything, as Iman knows. It's the first song I played for each of our children as they were born, but it's also a very good song for a researcher to live by. So Dylan wrote, "Come gather around people wherever you roam and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing." So I've used this a lot, including at the graduation last year. What does it mean for a researcher? Well, it means that you have to adapt to technology, you have to adapt to epidemiology, you have to adapt to science and to medicine, to humanity. But what it doesn't mean is that you change your profession. Because at the end of the day, Bob Dylan, who won the Nobel Prize last year and probably won't show up to Sweden, but you never know with him, is still a popular musician. So that's an initial statement to the young researchers, is that most of us, no matter how gray, tend to think of ourselves in the more classical American model. I still think of myself as an aerodigestive tract cancer physician and researcher. And why? Well, let's look at the most recent, reasonably validated data on tobacco-related deaths from cancer worldwide. And if you look at these data, they're quite impressive. For all the improvements that I'm going to show you in tobacco control in the United States, there will be almost 1.6 million deaths from lung cancer alone. And if you add the second major disease I've focused on most of my career, which is head and neck cancer, that's about 2 million deaths from cancer in the world. And so it's interesting to say that these have started to decline in the United States, in parts of Western Europe, but in the Far East, in China, where we devoted a whole issue 16 months ago from cancer, those numbers are actually up and they continue to increase dramatically. Step back to 10 years ago exactly, which was the publication by a group of researchers from the Dana-Farber led by Kwok Wong. And this is my "the world is small" analogy. So this is a collaboration between Kwok Wong, who I gave a tour to when he was an incoming first-year student or prospective first-year student at Columbia, and by Matthew Meyerson, who spoke last year at my inauguration, who's a friend that I made when I was a junior at Yale and he was a junior at Harvard, which defined the targetable lesions in lung cancer. And these targetable lesions included oncogenes or growth proliferating genes like EGFR, like RAS, and tumor suppressor genes like P53. This looked at a large number of tumors using state-of-the-art genomic techniques, and it noticed that in general there was a driver oncogene in most lung cancers, the most common driver oncogene being RAS, and the most common tumor suppressor gene being P53. But the next most common tumor suppressor gene, which is STK11 or LKB1, is one that I'm going to talk about, because that's still present in about 11% is mutation, 21% it's altered. So fast forward to the impact of the EGFR mutation on EGFR-related treatment. This is two papers that came out simultaneously from the two Harvard groups at the Mass General and at the Dana-Farber, which showed that there were mutations in the tyrosine kinase binding domain of EGFR. These were discovered by Matthew Meyerson's group at the Farber and by Dan Haber's group at the General, two groups that don't collaborate, and these indicated why certain patients with lung cancer were so sensitive to the small molecule tyrosine kinase inhibitor gefitinib. And over time, these individuals began to be defined not so much by their phenotype. They tended to be, yes, young, never smokers, Asian preponderance, but if you look at the series of studies that came out, these are present in all populations, including several patients that I have seen here with either Hazem Assi and Arafat Tufaili. So it's not an Eastern Asian disease. It's a disease which satisfies many of the precepts of a driver oncogene. These individuals have mutations, they don't seem to be tobacco related, and they're exquisitely sensitive to intervention with a small molecule tyrosine kinase inhibitor. Here's a very interesting study that was done in Eastern Asia. It was done with the assumption that there's a phenotypic definition. In other words, it took patients who were non-smokers with adenocarcinoma, the tumor that tends to have EGFR mutations, and it randomized them 1-to-1 to chemotherapy or gefitinib. And what the study showed is that actually if they had the mutation, and that's the group here on the side closest to me, it's you're facing, so it'll be your left, then the response rate, the likelihood of major tumor shrinkage by a third or more, was 71% with chemotherapy, 71% with the targeted therapy, 47% with chemotherapy. But if they didn't have the mutation, if they just had the phenotype but didn't have the mutation, the activity of the drug was abysmal, 1.1% response rate, and then chemotherapy, 23.5%. So this is very interesting. This is defining EGFR mutation as two things. One is a predictor of response and benefit, response to and benefit from EGFR targeting tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and two, it's actually a prognostic factor. I'm going to walk over here, forgive me if I'm not recording, because look, even with chemotherapy, the response rate is double what?
It's just missed it.
Thank you. That the response rate is double with chemotherapy if you have the mutation. So these patients do better, but also they respond to tyrosine kinases. And this shows, since this is really a group that is very interested in learning about clinical research and has a great deal of expertise in that area, this shows the evolution of clinical trials. In the past, the primary endpoint would have been what? Overall survival. But in this group with good options, there was crossover. So that if they progressed quickly, as the group who don't have the mutation but get the EGFR inhibitor do on the EGFR inhibitor, they switch to chemotherapy. So there are dramatic differences in progression-free survival, but thankfully no real difference in overall survival. That shows this is a state-of-the-art ethical trial, because if you know that one treatment is not likely to be that successful in a certain genetic context, you want the ability to rescue them with another treatment. I put this slide up here just to show you that no, this is not an Asian disease as it was initially rumored to be. These are European studies, North American studies, Japanese studies, Chinese studies. All of them show the same thing, that if they got the targeted EGFR inhibitor and they had the mutation, it was superior to any form of chemotherapy. And so this became a new standard of care. The problem is it's not a panacea. What happens to these patients? Virtually all of them eventually develop a form of secondary resistance. In a very nice paper by Leisha Sequist from the MGH showed that about half of these patients develop a secondary mutation, a T790 gatekeeper mutation, which changes the conformation of the EGFR tyrosine kinase binding domain so that it no longer binds gefitinib or erlotinib. Others, a third, have unknown mechanisms. Some, this was a big surprise, have transformation to small cell lung cancer. We saw one of these patients a month ago, and by the way, yes, they do still have some sensitivity to the initial treatment, but you add chemotherapy. And this study by Greg Riley and others basically showed that in these individuals with T790 mutation, they do have a clinical manifestation. They're less commonly detected in the central nervous system, and they probably do better than patients who progress, let's say, with a KRAS mutation or who are transformed to small cell lung cancer. So this is very interesting. It shows you one of the beauties of medicine. Now that you have genomic and molecular testing, there's still a clinical manifestation that you can then use to observe what's the likelihood. Of course, you're going to validate that with molecular testing. So after the development of the first generation TKIs, there was a need, first and second, there was a need to develop third generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And that race was on, and here's a paper, I think, that was presented in the European Journal of Cancer, which basically shows a dose escalation for patients who progressed on frontline chemotherapy and second-line EGFR inhibitor therapy or first-line EGFR inhibitor therapy. The common thing with these patients is they all had that classic initial EGFR tyrosine kinase mutation, and they were given a third-generation EGFR inhibitor. And this was an interesting study because what we're used to in phase 1 trial design, which I'm sure you've studied, is dose escalation to toxicity, and then you go to maximal toxicity, you go maximal tolerable dose, and then you typically do a phase 2 study with the dose immediately below that. Well, in this case, there really wasn't a great deal of difference between the medium dose and the higher dose. And so there was no incentive to give a higher dose than the standard reactive dose. And of interest, there was real activity. This was presented earlier this year and ultimately published in the New England Journal. And what that showed is that people who got this third generation EGFR inhibitor, among others, had a dramatically better difference in progression-free survival versus virtually any other treatment, to the point where almost 2 years out, you still don't have a plateau in the survival curve. It also shows a new way that we've been looking at things, at least in cancer research for the last 3 years. We start to look at the hazard ratio. So what is the ratio of progression-free survival? How much is that drug benefiting you in terms of improving your progression-free survival as a hazard? So in this case, it's almost a 66% reduction if you look at it through the hazard ratio. Subsequent trials validated that this and other drugs really made a significant difference in these patients who had an initial tyrosine kinase, a mutation in the tyrosine kinase binding domain, and then developed a T790 mutation. And interestingly, because these are the same drug, this drug survived, but the first drug that I showed you, because it had more toxicity, even though they tried to cost it down and because the company had less reserves, is now not in the market. So that's one of the first lessons I want to talk about today. Given the spiraling costs of healthcare, I'm not sure there's space for 3 or 4 very expensive tyrosine kinase inhibitors in the second and third line area, even though if you look at it globally, this is probably about 15% of all lung cancers. So if you saw the initial incident, about 1.8 million cases a year, 15% makes this a major disease. All of these will eventually progress. Half of those will develop a T790 mutation, but there wasn't space for multiple drugs based on cost and affordability. Why is that? Well, the cost of these drugs per month is probably not what the cost is coming to the patients. The cost to the patients is about $13,500 per month for an oral pill. Now, it's cheaper in Europe. It's cheaper still in most of Asia, apart from Japan. But it tells you something, that economics are starting to play a role in competitiveness of drugs in the marketplace. This is one of many mutations. This is, for example, a much rarer mutation. RET occurs in about 1% of all lung cancers. So of that 1.8 million, we're talking not about 180,000, but about 18,000 cases worldwide. Now, the majority of those cases, of course, will be in underdeveloped countries. But so far, there are multiple drugs in this space for two reasons, in my view. One, the test is cheaper. It wasn't patented, so this test to detect this mutation is probably less than $1,500 as opposed to the other test, which is several $1,000s. And two, the drugs are cheaper. And that's why there's still competition, even though this is a rare mutation. The next question is, can we use non-invasive testing to detect T790 mutations? Very interesting series of studies that I summarized with this one slide I took from the author from the ASCO meeting. If you use tissue, plasma, and urine, you would have thought that this covers everything. But it turns out that some of the changes are only detectable in urine, some only in tissue, and some in plasma. So it turns out that probably to get the best number of progressions, you do best by biopsying the tissue if it's accessible, but also collecting urine and plasma to look for the mutations. And I think this is probably going to be the way of the future. If we see a subtle change, we might get a urine or plasma test. If we see a very aggressive change, we're going to want to confirm that in the primary tumor tissue. So this is a slide that I've showed a few times, and I like to show again. Nowadays, I call it our sweat equity slide. So a lot of these things that you learn clinically actually happen because you're in the clinic, and I'm going to apologize to our chair of medicine. I missed my first clinic today. In 8 months, I'll make it up. Demerits for me. But a lot of these come from clinical observation. So that first observation of the EGFR mutation was actually observed by Tom Lynch in his clinic in the Mass General when he saw many patients who tended to have some things in common that were benefiting from gefitinib. They were women, they were younger than 45, they were typically Asian. That's what made Dan Haber actually look in those 11 or 12 tumor tissues to find the mutation. So the clinic is a place of great discovery. And it's especially fortunate if you can then take it to the lab. And I put up this particular picture for Samir's benefit because he actually found it on the web a few years ago. This was a fellow of mine who was from Lebanon. But I have to say that nowadays you need to assemble a large team of complementary expertise, and you need to be willing to pass the baton. These are the teams that were halfway through and towards the end of my Emory career. And you'll see that the group is getting actually, there are a few people who are constant. You know, Mike Kuttner, our indispensable biostatistician. My first rule is you can never have enough statisticians, especially if they talk to you. But for the most part, other than he and Haiyan Fu and Becky Pence, our ethicist, and Dong Shin, a lot of turnover in the team, and the team gets younger over time. So these two teams, we ran a program project grant that gave us about $11 million over 7 years, and started with the idea that we were looking at a surprising finding, a convergence of survival signals, which if you block them at the level of mTOR, caused an upregulation in a feedback loop that enhanced pharmacological dependence on that cell survival pathway. We showed that this pharmacological dependence and this surprising finding happens even in patients. We ran clinical trials, but at the end of the day, the changes were so rare and so difficult to target that this drug, which is now approved in 4 different cancers, was never really moved forward in lung cancer. And that's a lesson for some of the younger folks. All data are valuable, all quality data are publishable, but not all data are positive. And sometimes you learn your best lessons from negative experiments. I think some of the more experienced scientists in the room, Fouad Ziedi, Rad Al-Hajj, Iman, Mosayigh, Samir, others, would you disagree with that? That really high quality data, even if it's negative, is extremely important to publish. And that's a challenge we have in science. People get a negative result and then it's a permanent abstract. I've been guilty of that just because you run out of time. It's one of the biggest mistakes because people will keep doing that until someone finally publishes it. So please publish your negative data. That was almost $11 million worth of very important data, but the final yield was negative. So we decided to take things in a different direction, somewhat unorthodox direction. There's been so much work targeting oncogenes because an oncogene is like an accelerator. The goal is shut it off. It's much harder with a tumor suppressor gene because the tumor suppressor gene is your brake. You have to then replace your brake in every one of your cells. But as it turns out, tumor suppressor genes are probably driving the majority of cancers as opposed to oncogenes. So several years ago, George Sledge called these, the oncogene-driven tumors like CML, stupid tumors because you could target one thing, and these more complex things are smart tumors. But here's what turns out to be very interesting about tumor suppressor genes. In general, it's not just the tumor suppressor gene, it's a network of genes, including the tumor suppressor gene, that is regulating that tumor. And that's some of the information that we learned that I'll highlight in a little bit from this large program project grant. We found that this feedback loop, when we blocked rapamycin, using rapamycin, when we blocked mTOR and triggered this upregulation of AKT, we discovered there was this dependency in this feedback loop that particularly was manifest in cancers where the tumor suppressor gene was playing a major role. So we put in this program project grant while I was there, got a very good score, but now it's been resubmitted with a different leadership group, and it's being reviewed, I believe, the first week of February. And the idea is to target tumor suppressors to exploit LKB1 vulnerability in lung cancer. Led by Haiyan Fu and Suresh Ramalingam, and this is what happens to you, although it may not show it when you're old. I had them remove me and put me as part of the external advisory committee. Because at this point, even being on a conference call once a month, you're not really contributing. People may feel sorry for the old guy or the minimalist guy in the room, but it's a superb team and you have to trust them. So here are the projects. They're very provocative. And I'm just going to go over them very briefly. One essentially says that cancer cells have an entirely different metabolic circuit. And this is something we've known for many years. And that metabolic circuit is regulated on some level, to our surprise, by the tumor suppressor gene LKB1. And if we can block LKB1's regulation of cell cycle genes, then we can potentially reboot the cancer's metabolism. So that's one project, basic component with a clinical project. Another, and I'm going to show you a little more data because this paper will probably be my last co-senior or senior authored scientific paper for a long time, unless I'm wildly optimistic. That showed that there were a lot of protein-protein interactions at the very cellular level that determined the regulation of that tumor suppressor gene and then therefore other genes. And what that showed is that basically regulating the energy of LKB1 was a series of protein-protein interactions. And those protein-protein interactions were things that we discovered through a grant from the NCI that really was intended to look at what are called undruggable targets. So believe it or not, 20 years ago, tyrosine kinases were an undruggable target before Brian Drucker was able to target Gleevec, to use Gleevec to target CML. And protein-protein interactions, we thought we're going to look into this, and I'm going to show you about 5 years worth of work very quickly. We found some very interesting interactions that are dependent on whether LKB1 is mutant, what type of mutation is in LKB1, what type of KRAS oncogenic mutation is there, how they're driven. So the pattern of genomic mutations is modulated by their interaction, the interaction between these proteins, and it can control the cell cycle. The cell cycle then can reset the cancer cell's metabolism. So this is very exciting work. How is it applicable? Because, as I'm going to show you, oh, for some reason this is faded, but you can see it here. Because this actually can regulate a cell's dormancy or a cell's willingness to start to metastasize. And this is manifested all the way through proteins like FAC, which control the leading edge. So back to the clinic. How do you measure that in the clinic? We actually have surrogate markers in the clinic, which are very simply the number of metastases. So if you take patients who are stable after standard chemotherapy or standard targeted therapy, rather than always looking at survival or progression-free survival, you can start to measure the rate of development of new metastases, that person's metabolism, and then try to correlate whether your drug, in this case, an inhibitor of FAC, which was in the junkyard of a molecule-producing biotech company, has an impact on metastasis. And then your readout, whether you're looking at PET scans or looking at the cellular level, will give you a better correlation of whether or not you're impacting the disease. So this is how you put together these program project grants. You have different projects, all of which are at the level of an individual investigator grant, an R01, but they have to together be deemed to be more synergistic and worth more as a group than they would individually. That way, instead of giving you a couple of $100,000 a year for each R01, they might give you not only the money for the R01s, times 3 in this case, but for cores. So that's how you take a $250,000 grant to $1 million grant. And Mo, do you still have one of these? I know you had a few years ago. No? Yes? Surreptitiously under someone else's name? Rada, I know you had several of these, Fuad and others. So here's the idea. Metabolism interplays with proliferation as manifested as a readout of protein-protein interactions and cell cycle through metastasis, all focusing ultimately on one basic protein and its interaction with others. This is something that I won't lie, I'd like to see us do here one day. I'd love to see us develop a school of pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences where we could look at basic drug discovery. I do think that will help create not just microeconomies in Lebanon, but it'll allow us to look into a whole number of things. Of course, this could be a long-term project, but there, what we used is that first initial grant from the from the NIH to create a small molecule screening facility to now a facility at Emory, which is part of the Cancer Genome Atlas and is actually screening agents and their interaction to see if you can get a molecule that's a pre-drug. And this is important, as we told the then governor of Georgia, because, you know, there's a biotech industry in Massachusetts, there's a biotech industry in Northern California. There are pharmaceutical companies in New York and Pennsylvania that are not really successfully throwing off biotech companies. And why is that important? Well, ultimately, with pharmaceutical companies slashing their research and development budgets, about 90% of new ideas for drugs, for compounds, for novel therapies are now coming from academia. So my hope is that one day we'll see AUB be a major contributor to this enterprise. I'll skip through the rest of these, except to say not all of our attempts are so successful. 1433 is a protein that High-End Food defined when he was in his when he was a junior faculty at Harvard. It doesn't hurt that he was born on March 14th. This is a molecule that we worked for years to develop ways to target it. Rafael Rosell, our longtime collaborator from Spain, who I think I brought to MIMA in 2006, actually showed that it is prognostically important. We showed that it plays a role in anoikis and cell survival, but targeting it has proven very, very difficult because we are struggling to define which protein-protein interactions we can modulate in order to develop a target. But this became an approach that we pursued. We call it the post-targeted therapy approach. Whether you look at genomic alterations and gene protein expression, what we became more and more interested is the concept of a rewired protein-protein network in cancer and eventually developing novel forms of targeted therapy. Now, all my career, to be very honest, I was very interested in genomic medicine, targeted therapy, personalized medicine, and every time someone would come to me with a discussion of immuno-oncology, as Fadlo, who's a close friend for many years, can ascertain, what would I tell them? Not now. This is going nowhere. This is going to help a few people, not many people. Immunotherapy, 30 years away, I'll be dead. You know, Mo's smiling because he was in this business in immuno-oncology before I was. But as they say, the pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, but the realist has to adjust their sails. So from my perspective, reality is going to intrude on your data, and it's also going to intrude on your career. So this is my dabbling in the closest thing to immuno-oncology, that we had done oncolytic viral therapy that had shown that if we inject the oncolytic virus directly into the tumor in combination with chemotherapy, we could stop tumor progression in a series of head and neck cancers. I'll be the first to tell you we were completely wrong as to why it was successful, as was the company. They thought that these patients all had p53 mutations. It turns out that p53 just had to be turned off for the tumors to lyse. And a more potent virus, a reovirus, which could be given intravenously, had a much more profound effect in head, neck, and lung cancer. We were not involved in its development. But again, this study, a phase 3 study in lung and head and neck cancer, showed a reduction in metastasis but no impact in survival, which is what you'd expect potentially, right? Wouldn't necessarily expect with a non-cytotoxic drug to impact survival. But yet this trial, which we participated in, and I enrolled one of the last patients on 4 years ago, is still unpublished. Why? Negative data. Company buried it. In fact, the company is teetering on folding. So very important to learn. I would call this an important positive-negative study in that there were some important clues, but this was not to be the holy grail of immuno-oncology. This was to be the wow moment of immuno-oncology, the idea that we could use PD-1 and PD-L1 targeting to remove from the human immune system that sense of immune energy or exhaustion, whereby it stopped recognizing the tumor as anything foreign. So when that happened, the dam burst open and a number of new drugs came out. These are early trials with nivolumab, an anti-PD-1 inhibitor at various doses. And here's the very interesting thing. Most patients don't benefit from this reawakening of the immune system. But about 15 to 17% of patients have a very durable long-term benefit. And this seems to happen in lung cancer, in melanoma, which was where it was first discovered, in head and neck cancer, bladder cancer, I believe, esophageal, a number of different tumors. So a very interesting discovery. And if you remember some curves that I've shown over the years where you'll see most of the patients having a response, this waterfall plot shows you that a small minority of patients, 15%, have a significant tumor shrinkage. The difference between them and the targeted therapy patients is it can be really, really, really durable. And that overall survival, even in patients who failed 2, 3, 4 lines of therapy, that you have that tail of a curve at 1 year, 2 year, and longer. This moved into the frontline setting, looking at patients who are strongly PD-L1 positive. Could it make a difference? Second-line therapy versus docetaxel, yes. Patients who failed frontline therapy, if they're PD-L1 positive, you can improve median survival, not just the tail of the curve, by about 50%. But then you have to be smart. They're called targeted therapies, and it's called immuno-oncology because the target has to be there. It has to be overexpressed or driving a tumor. And so pembrolizumab, through all these trials, eventually got registered as a treatment in lung cancer, which was very exciting. Why? Because a significant number of patients who were PD-L1 positive, strongly expressed PD-L1 in their tumor and in their surrounding immune tissue had long-term durable benefit, significantly more than chemotherapy. This is great, except to go back to the previous issue of cost. These drugs actually cost a lot to manufacture, and they cost even more to give. So now you're talking about close to $18,000 to $20,000 per month, average cost. And in Lebanon, so far, if you have an indication, you can get this covered, which is why we predict, and this is work we're doing with the Ministry of Health, felt very proud to recruit an AUB MPH student in Rachel Teich to work with us. I bet you we can exhaust the Ministry of Health budgets with these drugs alone by March or April of each year. Not the cancer budget, the entire budget. So that's been an impetus for us to start looking at evidence-based medicine for cancer. That one day the ministers and others will thank us for, because it's very attractive to say, hey, maybe I'm one of that 17%. Well, if your tumor expresses it, maybe so, but if not, there's no real benefit. Why is that important? Because if you look at response rate, it's dramatically higher and more durable in those individuals who strongly express PD-L1 in about 50% of the tissue. And study after study has shown that for durable benefit, not 1 to 2 to 3 month benefit, for it to be highly predictive of benefit, PD-L1 has to be widely expressed. And so, for example, nivolumab, which looked very exciting in that previous study, when it was compared head-to-head to chemotherapy in patients who only had a 1% expression of PD-L1, it was not superior. So even in immunotherapy, expression and depth of expression of target is important. So this was the positive study. Again, they took a higher bar with pembrolizumab, and they showed it's significantly superior to chemotherapy, even in the frontline setting. And that's, believe it or not, a 12-month survival of 70%. Now, even if these patients are better, I want to remind people that when I went into this field about 27 years ago, 1 year survival for patients with best supportive care was under 5%, with chemotherapy was about 15%. Now we're talking about 1 year survival of 70%. That actually makes it harder, because now you're talking to patients and saying, there's a decent chance, almost 3 out of 4, that you'll survive 1 year if you have this marker, but this drug is going to cost the country about $250,000 a year. In a country where the median family income in Lebanon is $15,000. So this is a reality we're going to have to come to, but our hope is that if we have this data, and we certainly have the economic data in Lebanon, then we can approach companies the same way that former President George W. Bush, who's looking mighty good compared to what's coming right now, approached pharmaceutical companies to pay for multi-targeted AIDS therapy in Africa. So that could be at least some leverage to talk to companies about this. This is more data. To make a long story short, I mean, here's the interesting thing: that difference that you saw previously does not show the same when you look at nivolumab in less targeted patients. You see here, PD-L1 only had to be expressed in 1% of cells, or between 1 and 10%, and progression-free survival is actually inferior to chemotherapy. Anyone want to guess what chemotherapy really costs per month? About $600, maybe $1,000 if you include pemetrexed. So there is this yawning spectrum, not so yawning for the people who fund this, of cost-benefit ratio, something the nephrologists are painfully familiar with, I think, from data in Great Britain in the 80s. Am I correct, Fuad? So more and more data showing that it matters what type of expression. It's not just PD-L1, but there may be other markers, and the group at Emory is looking at a sort of a panoply of markers that together predict a very high likelihood of benefit from this treatment, up to 70% benefit, versus a group that if they're negative, predict a less than 10%. If that'll be validated, I think that'll be important. So, just to show you what happens with a positive result, I had this slide made a couple of months ago. Look at the number of companies in this space designing, as of this year, phase 3 trials in lung cancer for different immunotherapies. Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb, Pfizer, Roche, AstraZeneca. 5 companies, all pursuing the holy grail that's probably, in the US, going to account for about 45,000 patients, about a quarter of all lung cancer patients, and in the globe, 450,000 patients a year. I personally do not think at the end of the day there will be more than 2 or 3 of these products left standing. So let's talk about the basic cost of drug development. From discovery through putting a drug through phase 3 trial. Any ballpark guesses at what the cost is? 10 million. 10 billion per drug? For what?
Bone drugs.
Bone drugs. From soup to nuts? No, then cancer drugs are cheaper. Average cost is 1.5 to 2 billion from discovery through phase 3 trials. Billion. For these immuno-oncology drugs, 1.5 to $2 billion. From design to initial testing in animals, because the FDA, starting to recognize that even they have to pay for these spiraling costs, are now insisting on a companion diagnostic for EGFR targeted therapies and EGFR mutation. For immuno-oncology, what is the right marker? Is it PD-L1 or is it a panoply? So that also ratcheted up the cost. And the success rate for oncology drugs is between 7 and 9%. So that cost of 1.5 to 2 billion factors in the failures as well. The last few minutes, I want to talk briefly, if I can, about what I think the ultimate paradigm is. I hope I've convinced you that there's been tremendous progress in advanced lung cancer, but I think we need to concentrate more on earlier stage disease. And that earlier stage disease is, I think, the key. Earlier detection. So one of the challenges with EGFR targeted lung cancer is that they're non-smokers, so we can't screen smokers. But we can start to screen circulating DNA, and we have this fantastic data from the National Lung Screening Study where a simple 90-second low-dose spiral CT can reduce cancer-related mortality by 30% in a population of 55 to 70-year-olds who are active smokers. Now, of course, that can have a major impact also for radiation therapy. So all of a sudden, radiation therapy is looking very cheap. So this is an interesting discovery because some of these patients, if they're not surgical candidates, they do just about as well with intensive radiotherapy, with SBRT. And that goes back to cost. Look at the spiraling of FDA-approved costs for new drugs. And this is countries in the developing world who actually bear the greatest burden of new diseases. You see the curves are going up much faster than in the developed world. So most of the disease by 2030 will be where? Places like Lebanon, which have one of the highest rates of cancer as far as we can tell in the Arab world. Some studies, I'm sorry Ali Shamsuddin is not here because he presented a paper suggesting that Lebanon was the highest among the Arab world. And this is the trend in the developed world. So look at the decline in smoking from 1965 from the Attorney General's, from the Surgeon General's report, which was 53 years ago today, until now. Smoking in the United States, about 18%. I'll ask our exceptional faculty of School of Public Health, what's the smoking rate in Lebanon, to our best knowledge? Rima or Iman? 40%. So more than double. And if you look at this age standardized prevalence of tobacco smoking among persons aged 15, it's really quite remarkably skewed towards what Iman has taught me to say is the global south. Dramatically higher rates. Even Europe, Western Europe has been declining. Now we're starting to see some signs of early decline in Central and Eastern Europe, but not the rest of the world. And global cigarette consumption going up or going down? Going up. Here's the frightening thing, e-cigarette use. Here's the technology that's supposed to help people quit smoking, but actually in never smokers, teenagers in particular, who use an e-cigarette, they're twice as likely to pick up a real cigarette as someone who's never tried an e-cigarette. So even though these were developed in theory to help people quit smoking, if you've never smoked, you pick up an e-cigarette because it's cool, you're twice as likely to smoke a real cigarette. I want to say I'm very proud, even though I have nothing to do with this, of the contribution of this institution in particular. When we talk about making society healthier, this is the work of faculty in health sciences, in medicine, in engineering, but really this is the leadership of FHS to really start to make science into law. And this is science from Alan Shahadi and Najat Saliba and many others, also starting to impact international law and international science. So here's my concern. 16% of the world's population, 16% are protected by comprehensive national smoke-free laws. As of this last October, less than 6 months ago, there were 1,700 smoke-free campuses in the US, but only 1,427 were fully tobacco-free. That's the US. This is our goal that'll be led by a couple of faculty in health sciences, that January 1, 2018, AUB will be entirely tobacco-free, not just cigarette, tobacco-free. And I think we're going to try to do this the right way, have more smoking cessation counselors, teaching, do this gradually, and also incentivize people to become tobacco-free. Why? Because the silver bullet has failed. We were part of that failure. The idea that you get tobacco-related damage across the field, let's say this is a badly drawn lung, and you treat the first tumor, and then a second tumor is generally fatal. But even when we understand the molecular mechanisms, such as those driven through COX-2, and this is work that we did over decades, we really can't do any effective intervention if the individual quits smoking. This is a trial that's finally ongoing in China, in which there is a smoking cessation component built in, then targeted chemoprevention, and then we'll see if it's effective. Why? Because the initial promise of chemoprevention, of using high doses of natural compounds to prevent cancer development, has failed. This is the landmark study run by my mentor, Ki Hong, and published in the New England Journal over 25 years ago, showing that if you gave very high doses of vitamin A, You could prevent second head and neck cancers. But if you make the dose less, you really have no impact except in individuals who quit smoking. And that's been shown in study after study, irrespective of whether it's selenium or low-dose vitamin A in head and neck cancer or low-dose vitamin A in lung cancer. All of these studies have failed in the absence of smoking cessation. We can tell you, at least now, and this is the work of Avi Spira at BU, the genomic signatures of the individuals who may benefit from chemoprevention if they quit smoking. But if they don't quit smoking, this pretty much doesn't matter. That shows you just how powerful a weapon tobacco is. If you don't quit smoking, a genomic signature that can predict this degree of difference in preventing second cancers goes away. So you have to quit smoking. It's mightier than your genotype. I think there's been a lot of progress, and I'm excited about that progress. Immuno-oncology has really changed the way we think, both from defining populations that may have durable benefit in the most miserable of situations, but also from a cost perspective. I think we have admitted after several decades that we've underinvested in education and smoking cessation and in screening. But how do we make the first world or global north benefits translate to the south when we have smoking rates of 40% in adults and not insignificant in teenagers? That's my sense of the power of an institution like AUB. We can educate, we can do research, but we can also advocate, something that I think we don't do enough of. So in conclusion, I want to really take my hat off to all of you who've done a tremendous amount of very nice work with limited resources. And I thought here we would announce that we've reached at least an agreement, thanks to the director of CNRS, Dr. Maureen Hamzi, for a 2-year stimulus, we'll call it, that you'll be hearing about from the provost's office, where we'll be able to offer an additional, we hope, $800,000 a year in research money for our faculty that, as Dean Nguyen had asked this morning, does not replace the funding already coming from CNRS, and hopefully a lot of that will find its way to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, President Khuri. This is a wonderful trip from the bench to the bedside, back and forth, from medicine to public health policy and advocacy. I really think it's very inspiring, a lot of lessons learned. The next one is really inspiring, and I think we all have experienced that, and there is always something in negative data. Larry Riggs, a big bone authority, almost Nobel Prize winner, says, believe your data, don't believe your hypothesis, and think about it and be creative. It could be useful. So without further ado, I really want to thank you again, thank the faculty for some enlightening questions. We can take maybe a few for 5-7 minutes. Maybe I can start with one. I may have been off by tenfold for the billion thing, but one of the things that has really haunted Merck, which I thought was really investing in immunotherapy, is a phase 3 trial that actually was halted at the FDA submission stage, and that really was a killer. How common is that with oncology drugs? And of course, this is adding to the cost that you're mentioning here.
So in general, in my experience with FDA or EMEA, the European agency, the company does a lot of consultation before they do a phase 3 study. They can go ahead and do a phase 3 study even without FDA or EMEA blessing, but that's almost the death knell for FDA or EMEA, which is more conservative than going ahead to approve the drug unless there's a real home run. So if you move forward with a stop signal after phase 2 or small phase 3, then you have to really hit it out of the ballpark, as they say, to be likely to get approval. So for FDA to advise people not to move forward into phase 3 is not uncommon. For them to halt a phase 3, in my experience, is almost always about safety or clear sign of lack of efficacy.
Actually, it was completion of phase 3, successful fracture rates, deleterious cerebrovascular rates, that the company didn't come forward even. I mean, it was completed. It was way gone. Yeah.
That's unusual.
Safety.
Failure on safety is not as unusual, though.
Thank you, Dr. Khuri. Really interesting lecture. I have two questions. The first, can you comment on the role of circulating tumor cells as diagnostic, prognostic biomarker for lung cancer? And the second, since...
It's working.
And the second, since we are a country with a high rate of smoking, not only to mention الأرجيل smoking. So if we're not able to implement primary prevention, can we implement secondary prevention for early detection of lung cancer?
So the question on secondary prevention is probably a worthwhile one because of everything I showed you. A CT scan, spiral CT scan is very cost effective. And if anything, in this population where you have more smoking, more than twice as many smoking per capita as you do in the US, it's likely that we'll find more curable lesions early. From my perspective, circulating tumor cells remain a question mark for the following reasons. In a way, it's a manifestation of metastatic disease. So the greatest utility so far has been to say, this is when someone is progressing, or is it going down? Are they responding to an initial therapy? That's where I think they'll go first. However, having said that, if you think of the concept of adjuvant therapy in lung cancer or breast cancer, the assumption is that you're curing micrometastatic disease. That's the very interesting thing about cancer that people don't think about. Cancer is a rare chronic disease that we cure some end-stage disease. So I think that's likely to be the first use.
So circulating tumor cell as prognostic biomarker to differentiate, for example, between sensitive and resistant patients.
Yes, and predictive of response to therapy.
Yeah, but not as diagnostic.
Not a diagnosis, because I think even if you find it at initial disease, no, if you find it at surgical disease and you find no radiologic manifestation of disease, you're obligated to try to treat with adjuvant chemotherapy to attempt to cure, which does happen if there's no other case.
Thank you.
If I can ask a second question, sure. Going from cancer lung to neuroendocrine tumor and multiple endocrine neoplasia. Nature is very thrifty. A lot of these pathways are common to other tumors. Has there been any flow over from lung cancer drug discovery to any on the horizon for MEN tumors, for example? Some of these key molecular pathways you've highlighted are common and inherent.
So, I mean, we had thought initially, for example, that the mTOR inhibitors would be interesting in multiple endocrine neoplasia. So just like many years ago, we handed over our primary data on farnesyltransferase inhibitors to a researcher from Harvard when the drugs had died who was interested in them in neurodegenerative diseases. We handed over some of our cellular data to look at, MEN3 to see if mTOR inhibitors would be interesting. It's too early to say, but there is a hint of activity because, as you say, these pathways are conserved. And they're conserved from mammals, in some cases even in bacteria and eukaryotes.
All right. If there are no questions, I really want to thank you for an inspiring lecture, for taking the time for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.